the sea around Guadalcanal did not look cursed in daylight. Sunlight turned the water bright and blue, and from the deck of a destroyer it could almost seem gentle. Yet chart after chart in the operations rooms of the Allied fleet told a different story. The names of lost cruisers and destroyers crowded the maps, a graveyard written in ink. Sailors had started calling the water's iron bottom sound because so many ships now rested on its floor. In the months before August 1943, the night belonged to the Japanese Navy. Allied crews felt it every time the sun dropped behind the horizon. The light drained away from the waves, the mountains of the Solomon Islands became dark, jagged shapes, and a familiar quiet dread settled over the men on watch. Somewhere out in that blackness, enemy ships moved with confidence, guided by sharp eyes and drilled habits. The Japanese were masters of the night, and everyone seemed to know it. The defeat at Savo Island still hung like smoke over every briefing. In one terrible night in August 1942, Japanese cruisers had slipped through the darkness and smashed an Allied force guarding the approaches to Guadalcanal. 4 heavy cruisers had gone down, more than 900 men killed before many of them even understood what was happening. Survivors remembered only flashes of orange light, sudden explosions, and the sickening roll of steel as ships capsized. It was not just a tactical loss. It was a shock to the belief that the Allied navies could stand up to their opponent after dark. Ever since that disaster, every alarm at night felt sharper. Watch standards grew stricter, more lookouts, more drills, more orders shouted across steel decks. Yet for all the effort, the pattern kept repeating. Japanese destroyers and cruisers would slip down what Allied sailors called the slot, the narrow sea passage between the Solomon Islands. They brought troops and supplies to their own forces and hurled shells at Allied positions almost with impunity. They struck fast, launched their long-range torpedoes, and vanished again into the blackness before most Allied gunners had proper targets. On the chart it seemed simple enough. Patrol lines were laid down. Destroyer divisions were sent to intercept the so-called Tokyo Express supply runs. But out on the water the reality was messy. Rain squalls rolled in without warning. The moon vanished behind high clouds. Islands blocked lines of sight. A destroyer could be only a few miles from an enemy force and yet have no idea it was there until the first shells began to fall. Allied ships did have radar, at least in theory, that should have helped. The early air search sets had been a miracle for spotting incoming aircraft and giving warning to carriers. But the older surface search sets were temperamental and imprecise. Screens flickered with vague blips, and clutter from land echoes muddied the picture near the islands. Officers who had grown up judging everything by what they could actually see often hesitated to trust a ghostly green smear on a scope. The Japanese, meanwhile, had built their night doctrine around old-fashioned skills. Their lookouts were trained to an extreme standard, learning to see distant silhouettes and muzzle flashes where others saw only darkness. They practiced coordinating gunfire and torpedo attacks in the dark. Their long lance torpedoes could run far and hit hard, sometimes exploding against Allied ships that never even saw the flash of their launch. Stories about those torpedoes traveled quickly from ship to ship. Men told one another how the weapons could reach out beyond the range most destroyer captains even considered dangerous. Torpedoes became another invisible threat, gliding under the surface, impossible to spot until it was far too late. Combined with the memory of Savo Island, the effect was heavy. The night began to feel like a place where the Allied fleet could only hope to endure, not to win. And yet, in back rooms and laboratories half a world away from the black waters of the Solomons, something new had been taking shape. Physicists and engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory had been working with a powerful British invention called the cavity magnetron. This compact device allowed radar to use much shorter wavelengths. That meant sharper resolution and smaller antennas that could fit easily on warships. The result was a new family of radars that promised to make the surface of the sea far clearer to those who knew how to read the screens. One of these sets, radar type SG, began to appear on Allied destroyers. It could pick out individual ships at useful ranges, even in rough weather or near land. On test runs it drew crisp points of light where older sets had shown fuzzy blobs. For the officers and operators who believed in it, Radar Type SG offered something almost intoxicating. The chance to see first at night, to know where the enemy was before the enemy knew the same about them. But technology alone was never going to be enough. The Allied Navy still carried scars from early missteps with radar-guided tactics. There had been battles where radar contacts were misread, firing orders confused, and opportunities thrown away because no one quite trusted the electronics or knew how best to combine them with gunnery and torpedo work. Some commanders still preferred to rely on searchlights and visual bearings, even though those tools had repeatedly betrayed them in the face of stealthy Japanese strikes. In the summer of 1943, as the struggle for control of the Central Solomons intensified, a group of officers began to think differently. They studied the patterns of the night battles and the capabilities of the new equipment. They pored over reports of defeats, not to wallow in them but to understand exactly where things had gone wrong. They asked blunt questions about why the Japanese seemed always to gain the first blow. Piece by piece, a new idea took shape, one that combined Radar Type SG, destroyer flexibility, and aggressive torpedo tactics. Among those officers was Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, a calm and methodical leader who understood both the potential and the limitations of the ships under his command. He had watched the earlier battles with frustration, seeing how often caution, confusion, or hesitation had turned possible victories into draws or defeats. Now he was in a position to try something different. The waters around the island of Kalimbangara were becoming a key route for enemy traffic. Japanese destroyers were still running supplies and reinforcements down the slot, trying to keep their footholds alive even as Allied air power and ground forces pressed them. Allied commanders knew these runs were continuing, and they knew that if they did not find a way to break them decisively, the fight for the Solomons could drag on at a terrible cost. So plans were drawn for another interception, another night patrol where fast destroyers would wait in ambush along a likely route. In many respects it looked like earlier attempts. A small force of sleek gray ships, crews trained and seasoned by months at sea, assigned to hunt in the dark. Yet this time there were quiet differences. Radar Type SG sets hummed on more of the ships. Torpedoes were loaded and checked with a sharper sense of how they might be used. And in Moosbrugger's mind, there was a clear intention not merely to endure another terrifying night, but to try to seize control of it. The men on those destroyers did not yet know exactly what awaited them. To them it was another mission order, another night steaming into constricted waters where black silhouettes of islands loomed and disappeared, and every shadow on the horizon might be an enemy. The memory of iron-bottom sounds sailed with them. The fear of long lance torpedoes rode the waves under their hulls. As the sun slipped away and the sky turned from deep blue to star-speckled black, the old feeling of risk returned. But high above in the masts and within the plotting rooms, radar screens began to glow with quiet confidence. Unlike nervous human eyes, the beams swept the darkness with steady patience, ready to reveal whether this night would follow the old pattern of dread and surprise, or begin to write something entirely different into the history of the Pacific War. All afternoon on 6 August 1943, the destroyers that would soon fight at Vela Gulf went about their familiar routines. Men hosed down decks, checked lines, and carried crates of food and supplies along narrow passageways. Engine rooms throbbed with heat as watchstanders minded gauges and valves. For most sailors it felt like another long day in the endless chain of operations that made up the Solomon Islands campaign. Yet the officers moved with a particular focus. In cramped wardrooms, they bent over charts spread across tables bolted to the deck. Pencils traced routes up the slot, in and out between the jagged outlines of the islands. Kalimbangara sat on the map like a dark eye, a place the Japanese were determined to hold and the Allies were determined to isolate. Intelligence reports, air reconnaissance, and previous patrols all suggested the same thing. Another run of enemy destroyers carrying men and supplies would likely come down that route under cover of darkness. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger studied those charts with measured calm. He had under him 6 destroyers, fast and well-handled ships that had already seen their share of hard duty. Dunlap, Craven, and Maury formed one group. Lang, Sterrett, and Stack formed another. Together they would patrol near Vela Gulf, the stretch of water north of Kalimbangara and south of Vela. It was an area already stained in the minds of sailors by recurring night raids and the occasional explosive meeting of ships and shells. Moosbrugger knew the history as well as anyone. He had read the reports from Savo Island and from the bitter fight off Tassafaranga, another battle where Japanese long-lance torpedoes had turned a seeming advantage into a sudden disaster for cruisers and destroyers of the Allied force. In both cases, radar had been present but poorly used, hampered by uncertainty and habits carried over from earlier eras. Guns had opened fire too soon or at unclear targets. Torpedoes had been launched late or at confused bearings. The enemy had slipped away after dealing punishing blows. From those accounts he drew a simple conviction. If he was going to meet a Japanese column at night, he needed to do it on clear, disciplined terms. The new radar type SG would be the key. Its short wavelength beam and precise scope could give him an accurate picture of enemy movement long before anyone on deck could see a silhouette. If he could trust that picture, he could place his destroyers where they needed to be and time a torpedo attack before the Japanese even sensed danger. So the plan that took shape that afternoon was built around surprise and restraint. Moosbrugger would use his destroyers as torpedo platforms first and gun platforms second. One division would lead, slipping ahead on a slightly different track where it could cross the path of any approaching column. The other division would hang back, ready to open gunfire once the torpedoes had already done their work. By delaying gunfire, he aimed to keep the enemy blind for as long as possible. Word of the plan filtered down through the chain of command in fragments. Junior officers received their orders in more detail, learning courses, speeds, and formations. Sailors learned only what they needed to know. There would be action tonight. Torpedoes would be important. Radar contacts would be followed closely. They took the information in stride. By this point in the war, none of them expected an easy patrol. Below decks, in the radar spaces, the operators looked over their SG consoles with a sense of quiet responsibility. The equipment itself was not much to look at from the outside. Metal cabinets, cables, and round scopes with their glowing green faces. Yet everyone on board was gradually grasping that these devices could mean the difference between being surprised and doing the surprising. The operators had been through repeated drills, learning to distinguish real contacts from clutter, to judge range and bearing quickly, and to pass information to the plotting rooms without confusion. They knew the limitations as well. Nearby islands produced strong echoes that could hide or mimic ships. Rain squalls could cause bursts of meaningless speckling. A tired operator could misread a faint blip and send a destroyer division chasing a phantom. For that reason, the most skilled men were chosen for the night watches. They drank their coffee, adjusted their headphones, and prepared for long hours of scanning the same circular sweep again and again. As the day wore on, orders came to get underway. Lines were cast off, screws churned the water into white froth, and the destroyers slipped out in sequence from their anchorage. The islands around them glowed green under the late afternoon sun, but ahead the slots stretched out like a corridor that everyone knew would turn treacherous once the light dwindled. On the bridges, captains and navigation officers checked bearings and confirmed formations over the voice tubes and internal communication circuits. The 6 ships settled into their assigned positions. Moosbrugger's flagship led his division, with Craven and Maury behind. The 2nd Division, under another experienced commander, followed on a roughly parallel track at a measured distance. This separation was not casual. It was part of the design. If the leading destroyers could launch their torpedoes undetected, the trailing group would be able to exploit any confusion with gunfire and additional torpedoes, all while the Japanese struggled to work out where the attack was coming from. The sun slid down toward the horizon, turning the western sky orange and red. On deck, the colors ceremony was brief and subdued, barely noticed by many of the men now deep into their own preparations. Torpedo crews checked the launchers yet again, making sure every tube was ready to fire. Shells and powder for the main guns were brought to hand. Signalmen tested their lamps even though the plan called for silence and darkness. Habit demanded readiness on every front, even if some tools would ideally remain unused. When darkness finally fell, it did so with the sudden completeness common in the tropics. One moment there was still a band of glow along the horizon. The next, the islands were black masses against a field of stars. The 6 destroyers moved on, barely visible to one another except as hints of structure against the faint sky and as tiny smears of light where someone had not yet fully dogged a hatch or shielded a porthole. Inside the ships, the world narrowed. Red lights in passageways preserved night vision. Men not on watch tried to sleep in cramped bunks, lulled and jarred by the constant vibration of machinery and the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull. Those on duty focused on their stations, aware that somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of their eyes, another column of ships might already be threading its way down the slot, following the same narrow lanes between reefs and islands that both sides had now memorized. On the radar scopes, the sea began as a mostly empty circle of faint noise. The coastline showed as a steady curve of stronger echoes. Each sweep of the beam drew the same pattern again and again, a hypnotic repetition broken only when something new appeared. The operators listened to the soft hum of the equipment and to the murmur of voices in the plotting rooms beyond, where officers either chatted quietly or sat in their own private thoughts about the night ahead. The Japanese, for their part, were indeed coming. Their destroyers were loaded with supplies and troops bound for Kalimangra, part of yet another effort to reinforce and sustain their garrisons. As on so many previous nights, they relied on speed, darkness, and drilled routines. Their lookouts scanned the horizon and the black shape of the sea, confident in their training and in the assumption that if any enemy ships were near, they would spot them in time. They did not know that this time they faced something quite different. They could not see the narrow, focused pulses of energy sweeping out from the American destroyers, bouncing off metal hulls and returning as signals on scopes. They could not hear the quiet conversations in English in which ranges and bearings were read off from SG radar and marked onto transparent plotting boards. They had no way of sensing the invisible web of information that was beginning to form around them as the 2 destroyer divisions advanced. Hour by hour, the distance between the 2 forces shrank. The destroyers under Moosbrugger held their speed, neither rushing forward recklessly nor lagging behind. The navigation officers checked and rechecked their positions against known landmarks and dead reckoning. The night air smelled faintly of salt and fuel oil. Somewhere in the dark water, long lance torpedoes sat in their tubes aboard the Japanese ships, just as the American torpedoes sat waiting in their own launchers, silent promises of violence that had not yet been called upon. Near midnight, the tension in the radar shacks rose notch by notch. The operators knew they were nearing the point where earlier patrols had made contact with enemy columns on previous nights. Their eyes tracked the same arcs over and over, looking for any new return that did not fit the pattern of land or friendly ships. Sweat beaded under headphones and inside uniforms despite the relatively cool night air. Every faint trace was studied, every slight irregularity weighed. Then, at 23:33 hours, one of the SG sets showed a new point of light where there had been only emptiness moments before. It was small at first, almost easy to dismiss as a ghost. But with each sweep of the beam it returned in the same place, then a little closer, then a little stronger. An operator leaned in, adjusted the gain, and measured the range with practiced care. More specks appeared near it, separate but moving in the same general direction. Information began to flow toward the plotting rooms. Bearings were called out, ranges reported, contacts marked. On transparent boards lit from beneath, tiny grease pencil symbols appeared to represent unknown ships approaching on a track that would carry them dangerously close to the American destroyers. In the silent darkness outside, nothing had changed. The sea still seemed empty, the islands still only black shapes under the stars. But inside, for those watching the glowing scopes and the evolving plots, the night had suddenly become very full indeed. Inside the plotting rooms of the destroyers, the first confirmed radar contacts changed the entire character of the night. Only minutes earlier, the atmosphere had been tense but routine, the kind of alertness crews had grown used to after months of patrolling the slot. Now every man who heard the call of new contacts felt the jolt of awareness that signaled the beginning of real action. Voices stayed low, but the pace of work sharpened. Grease pencils moved faster across the plotting boards. Bearings were repeated for confirmation, then repeated again. Operators checked their scopes with the disciplined calm taught through long drills. The air inside the compartment seemed heavier, filled with heat from the equipment and the weight of what the glowing dots represented. Commander Moosbrugger received the first report with the same steady demeanor he had shown all day, but the officers around him could sense a quiet shift in his focus. This was the moment everything had been built toward. For months the Navy had analyzed earlier failures, studied radar tactics, and tried to understand how to fight the Japanese after dark. 4 weeks the destroyers had carried the new SG sets, learning their rhythms and their quirks. For hours they had steamed into hostile waters with the knowledge that an enemy column might appear at any moment. Now, on a night thick with heat and tension, they finally had what they needed. A clear, solid detection. An enemy formation moving on a predictable path, unaware that it had been revealed. The contacts held steady on the scopes. Operators reported that the blips were too consistent, too structured to be anything other than ships. Not a single one. Not a pair. Several. Their movement showed purpose. Their speed suggested destroyers or fast transports rather than slow barges. Their track placed them right on the expected reinforcement route toward Kalimbangara. And most critically, they were closing the distance in a way that would bring them directly across the torpedo-firing arc of Moosbrugger's leading division if nothing went wrong. In earlier battles, commanders had often been forced into rushed decisions. Sometimes radar contacts were faint or confusing, forcing guesswork. Sometimes orders higher up the chain pushed ships into awkward formations. But tonight the picture was different. The contacts were strong. The positions matched expectations. The seas were relatively calm. The American destroyers were spread in a formation designed for exactly this kind of moment. And for the first time in many months of bitter fighting, the advantage was beginning to feel like it belonged to the Allied force. Above deck, nothing about the scene suggested the approaching clash. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glimmer of stars overhead. The ships ran with all lights extinguished, their hulls blending seamlessly with the black surface of the water. No searchlights cut through the air. No signal lamps flashed. The men on watch peered into the night and saw only emptiness, unaware that only a few thousand yards away the Japanese column was gliding into a carefully laid ambush. Below deck, in the machinery spaces, the thrum of the engines masked the rising tension. Men stood at gauges, throttles, and valves, knowing only that the ship was maintaining a steady speed and course. They could not see the radar blips. They could not follow the growing urgency of the plotting boards. Their world was a hot metal chamber lit by red lamps, filled with the smell of oil and the constant vibration of engines driving the ship toward a moment they could not witness. They would only know the battle had begun when the ship lurched or the deck above shook under the pressure of exploding torpedoes or the thunder of guns. Far ahead, the Japanese destroyers cut through the dark water with a confidence gained from so many earlier successes. Their lookouts scanned the horizon for the faintest flicker of light, the slightest silhouette of an enemy ship. Yet the sea and sky offered nothing. The American destroyers remained invisible, drifting below the threshold of human detection. To the Japanese crews, the night seemed safe. Their formation held steady. Their mission continued as countless missions before had done, relying on speed and silence to evade danger. But danger was now all around them. They simply could not see it. Moosbrugger studied the evolving plot, noting how the enemy ships formed a loose but purposeful line. The ranges were shrinking, but not too quickly. Every update confirmed what he needed to know. The enemy was closing at an angle that would allow his lead division to cross ahead of them without being noticed. The timing would be tight, but the path was clear. In the past, American commanders had sometimes opened gunfire at the first sign of a target, hoping to overwhelm Japanese crews before torpedoes could be launched. But firing too early had often revealed their position and allowed the enemy to respond. Tonight, that mistake would not be repeated. He held the guns silent and let the radar operators guide the approach with mathematical precision. In the torpedo rooms, the crews checked their tubes again. They confirmed gyro settings, ensured safety devices were removed, and waited for the order that would unleash the destroyer's most devastating weapons. The Mark 15 torpedo had been unreliable in the early months of the war, plagued by depth issues and faulty detonators, But by the summer of 1943 many of those problems had been solved. The torpedo crews carried a quiet hope that the weapons would run true and fast tonight. Minute by minute, the destroyers glided deeper into the unseen geometry of the coming battle. Every change in the bearing of the Japanese formation was fed into the calculations. Every slight shift in course brought Moosbrugger's ships closer to the ideal firing position. Time stretched thin. The operators who had first spotted the contacts kept their voices calm, but the edges of their words sharpened with adrenaline. The officers marking the boards felt their pulses quicken. The bridge crews sensed an approaching threshold, a moment when the stillness of the night would end. A few dozen yards above the sea, the SG radar continued its tireless sweep. With each rotation of the antenna, the picture grew clearer. The enemy was coming on almost exactly the expected path. The distance was closing. The vectors converged. The destroyers were in place. The Japanese were unaware. And the darkness that had once betrayed the Allied fleet was finally working in their favor. The geometry of the night battle finally settled into something clear enough to act upon. On the plotting boards aboard the leading destroyers, the lines and symbols that had been shifting slowly now held a firm, unmistakable shape. The Japanese column was advancing on a steady course, its ships running in a loose file that moved with the confidence of vessels that had used this route many times before. The American destroyers under Moosbrugger lay across that path like a thin blade, nearly invisible in the dark, guided not by eyesight but by the unwavering glow of radar-type SG. Reports came in at measured intervals. Range decreasing. Bearing steady. Speed estimated. Each new set of numbers confirmed what the commanders already believed. The enemy had not altered course. No evasive turns. No signs of awareness. The Japanese destroyers were gliding forward, unaware they had already been seen, measured, and placed into a firing solution. Moosbrugger held his formation with deliberate care. He knew that any premature move, any sudden shift in speed or heading, might disturb the fragile balance of surprise. Too early and the torpedoes might miss or be detected. Too late and the Japanese ships might slip past, forcing a confused chase in narrow waters where the long lance torpedoes could turn the tables with brutal speed. Timing now mattered as much as courage. Above them the tropical sky remained perfectly indifferent. Stars glittered in their thousands, reflected in faint ripples on the sea surface. The islands on either side of Vela Gulf were black masses against a slightly lighter horizon. No lightning flickered, no distant gunfire flashed. To anyone on deck who was not in the information loop, the night still seemed empty. Only the subtle changes in orders passed over internal communication circuits hinted that the ship was approaching something more than another routine patrol leg. In the radar rooms, operators leaned in close to their scopes. The faint hum of the equipment and the soft hiss of the sweep had become the rhythm of their night. The contacts that had first appeared as small, uncertain marks were now strong returns. The formation could be seen clearly enough to distinguish lead and trailing ships, to estimate the spacing between hulls, to judge where the torpedoes would have to cross in order to cut into their line. Range reports marched steadily downward. 12,000 yards. 11,000. 10,000. The numbers meant nothing to an untrained ear, but for the officers plotting the battle they represented a tightening coil. At some point along that scale, the moment for action would arrive. Torpedoes had an effective zone. Fire too far and the risk of misses grew, especially if the enemy altered course. Fire too close and there might not be time for the weapons to arm fully or for the launching ships to turn away from their own lines of fire. Moosbrugger had already decided on his method. The lead division would carry out the torpedo attack in near silence, guided entirely by radar bearings. Guns would stay silent until after the weapons were in the water. Searchlights would remain dark. No flares would be sent up to reveal positions. The Japanese were not to be given a single clue until warheads detonated. The destroyers eased into the firing position. Small differences in heading, almost imperceptible to a man standing on deck, brought their torpedo mounts into the correct angle relative to the Japanese track. In the cramped torpedo control spaces, the crews checked gyro settings yet again, verifying that the weapons would fan out across the expected path of the enemy column. The tubes were already loaded. Safety interlocks were prepared. Men ran hands over levers and wheels they had operated countless times in drills but rarely in battle at this scale. On the plotting boards, lines representing torpedo tracks were drawn in thin arcs across the projected Japanese course. Each pencil mark stood for a steel cylinder filled with fuel and explosives, soon to be hurled into the water at high speed. There would be 24 of them from the lead division, a concentrated salvo designed to saturate the space through which the enemy ships would pass. The Japanese destroyers continued on, still unaware. Their lookouts saw nothing but the usual shapes of distant islands and the dim glow of the sky to the south. No gun flashes. No silhouettes of foreign ships. Their commanders, experienced in these runs, had every reason to believe that another supply mission would slip through as previous ones had done. The long lance torpedoes sat ready, but there was no sign yet that they would be needed. Back aboard the American destroyers, the final preparations came together with precise calm. The signal for torpedo readiness moved from station to station. Engine rooms maintained the ordered speed. Steering held the course with small corrections. Bridge crews monitored every report from radar and plotting. The sense of waiting stretched out, yet in reality only minutes passed between the first firm contact and the point at which all the pieces were aligned. Then the mathematical conditions that Moosbrugger had been seeking finally converged. According to the plots, the Japanese column was exactly where it needed to be in relation to his lead division. Their projected path cut across the overlapping fan of his torpedo tracks at just the right distance. Too far for easy detection. Close enough for the torpedoes to reach before the enemy could react meaningfully, even if someone happened to glimpse a track in the dark water. Orders moved rapidly but quietly through the ship. There was no shouted alarm on deck, no sense of chaos. In the torpedo rooms the crews received the command they had been waiting for. Mechanisms were set. Firing circuits were engaged. The men stood poised over their controls. 24 weapons would be launched in just over a minute, a concentrated burst of steel and explosive potential. On the bridge, Moosbrugger committed. The time for theory and planning was over. The night that had so often favored the Japanese would now be tested under a different kind of vision. Radar Type SG had guided his approach. Torpedo doctrine refined from earlier painful lessons had shaped his scheme of attack. Now everything rested on how well those tools and ideas translated into the reality of black water, moving ships, and unseen targets. In rapid succession, the destroyers of the lead division released their torpedoes. Compressed air and mechanical systems hurled the weapons from their tubes into the sea. There was no great drama to the act from the outside. No flames, no roaring blast. Just a series of heavy metallic thuds along the decks, brief plumes of disturbed water, and then invisible shapes sliding forward under the surface at high speed. Within 63 seconds the full salvo was away. 24 torpedoes ran out from the American destroyers, their wakes invisible in the darkness. Each followed its assigned course, spreading into a deadly pattern that reached across the path of the Japanese column like the teeth of a submerged comb. The destroyers that had launched them began to turn away to clear their own firing lines, careful not to cut across the unseen streams of their own weapons. For a brief moment, after the last torpedo left its tube, there was a strange quietness to the scene. The American ships moved in disciplined silence. Their guns remained idle. The radar scope still showed the Japanese column advancing, unaware that the water ahead was now filled with unseen threats. No explosion had yet broken the night. On deck, the men who knew what had just happened could only imagine the torpedoes racing through the blackness, counting down the seconds until their paths intersected with steel hulls. Out in Vela Gulf, beneath the star-speckled sky, the invisible lines drawn by planners and operators turned into reality as the torpedoes sped on toward the approaching Japanese ships. Once the torpedoes were in the water, the battle entered a strange hidden phase. Nothing on the surface changed at first. The American destroyers under Moosbrugger continued their steady movement through the darkness, turning as planned to clear the paths of their own weapons and to prepare for whatever would come next. Their guns still pointed into the night unfired. The radar scopes still showed the same steady cluster of contacts moving along the same predictable track. Somewhere between the two lines of ships, unseen beneath the surface of Vela Gulf, 24 torpedoes raced forward. Each one followed its assigned angle, cutting across the projected path of the Japanese column. If the calculations were right, those paths would intersect with steel hulls in only a short span of time. The men on the American destroyers could not see the weapons or their wakes, but in their minds they pictured them streaking through the black water, counting down the last seconds of their high-speed run. On the Japanese destroyers, nothing yet hinted at the danger. Their lookouts still scanned the horizon with trained eyes. They saw only the usual shapes of distant islands and the scattered points of starlight reflected on the waves. Their instruments showed no sign of unusual activity. The night seemed as it always had on these reinforcement runs, a deep cloak over the sea that had so often protected them from interception. The first warning they received was not visual at all. It was physical. One of the torpedoes found its mark along the side of a Japanese destroyer with a violent impact that broke the calm as completely as if the night itself had shattered. In an instant, the quiet of the Black Gulf gave way to a sharp orange flash and a towering column of water and flame as the warhead detonated against the hull of Hajikase. The force tore through steel plating, blasted inward into compartments, and hurled spray and debris high into the air. On the American destroyers, men who had felt nothing of the torpedo launch now felt the faint tremor of a distant explosion through their own decks. A moment later they saw the flash, a sudden flower of light on the horizon where moments before there had been only darkness. In the radar rooms, the scopes still showed the Japanese formation, but now some of the returns shifted in ways that suggested frantic maneuvers, disrupted spacing, and perhaps the abrupt slowing or stopping of a ship that had been hit. The pattern of destruction did not stop with a single strike. Within moments, other torpedoes from the same salvo found their targets. Another Japanese destroyer, Erasure, took a hit that ripped into its hull and ignited fuel and ammunition. The explosion lit the surrounding water with a brutal glare and sent shockwaves through the crew who had only seconds earlier believed themselves safe behind the shield of darkness. A third destroyer, Kaukazi, was caught as well. The torpedo that struck her drove in under the waterline and exploded with the same merciless effect, tearing through machinery spaces and compartments, flooding the ship almost at once. In a very short span of time, 3 vessels of the Japanese column were crippled or fatally damaged by weapons whose launch they had never seen. One destroyer, Shigure, experienced a different kind of encounter. A torpedo struck her rudder but failed to explode properly. Even so, the impact damaged her steering and forced emergency measures. That ship would ultimately manage to escape into the darkness, but at this moment in the battle, its crew knew only that something had gone very wrong with their course and response. From the perspective of the American commanders, the first explosions represented confirmation more thrilling and sobering than any words. The meticulous plotting, the faith in radar-type SG, the discipline of torpedo launch without visual contact, had all translated into real, visible effects. The flashes on the horizon and the sudden turmoil among the radar contacts meant that the enemy had been truly caught in the web of invisible tracks laid down minutes earlier. On Moosbrugger's plotting boards, the symbols representing the Japanese ships began to slide out of their smooth lines. Some slowed. Some turned. The neat column dissolved into a scattering of uncertain motions as damaged vessels lost control and others tried to evade. This disorder was exactly what the plan had been designed to create. A formation that had been steady and confident a few minutes earlier was now a cluster of ships in varying states of distress and confusion, still trying to understand where the attack had even come from. Only after the torpedoes had done their work did the guns of the American destroyers come into play. With the enemy already reeling, Moosbrugger and the commanders of the 2nd Division were now free to engage with gunfire without giving away the initial element of surprise. Orders moved from bridge to turrets. Main batteries swung toward the area where the flaming ships marked the disrupted Japanese line. Fire control teams used both radar and the sudden bursts of light from explosions to refine their ranges and bearings. When the American destroyers opened fire, the night that had been almost absolute darkness turned into a flickering, chaotic landscape. The bright flashes of 5-inch guns lit the decks and superstructures of the firing ships, throwing stark shadows and highlighting the tense faces of the crews for an instant before plunging them back into dimness. Shells arced outward into the Gulf, some aimed at targets already aflame, others at radar-indicated positions of still-moving enemy ships. For the Japanese crews, the experience must have been overwhelming. Already stunned by torpedo strikes whose origin they could not identify, they now faced rapid and precise gunfire from an enemy they still could not see clearly. The bright muzzle flashes from the American destroyers were brief and distant. To hit back effectively required knowing where to direct return fire, but with formations scattered, steering damaged on some ships, and the sudden onset of crisis, coordinated response became extremely difficult. The American destroyers, meanwhile, kept their movements controlled and purposeful. The lead division, having already turned away after its torpedo attack, now adjusted to maintain advantages of range and bearing. The trailing division closed to distances where their guns could work with particular effectiveness, raining shells onto ships that were already crippled or struggling. Throughout this, radar type SG continued to offer a clear picture of movement, allowing the Americans to track not just the blazing wrecks but also any surviving ships attempting to break away. In the space of a few short minutes, the balance of power in that patch of sea had shifted completely. At the start of the encounter, the Japanese column had been an intact force of seasoned night fighters moving confidently toward their objective. Now 3 of their destroyers were sinking or fatally damaged. Fires raged along shattered decks. Flooding rushed through torn compartments. Men who had trained for precise night tactics now found themselves fighting for control and survival amid ruins created by torpedoes they had never detected. The surface of Vela Gulf itself bore silent witness. Burning fuel spread in patches, casting wavering reflections upward onto smoke clouds and twisted silhouettes. Debris drifted among the waves. The starlight that had seemed so serene earlier now competed with the harsh glow of fires and occasional bursts from shells striking home. The Gulf, which had seen so many night operations before, was watching a very different kind of engagement unfold. On the American ships there was no celebrating, only focused work. Gun crews kept up controlled firing sequences, adjusting to new orders as targets were confirmed destroyed or lost beneath the waves. Radar operators reported every attempt by surviving Japanese vessels to turn away or evade, calling ranges and bearings with crisp precision. Damage control teams remained at their posts, ready in case of unexpected return fire or torpedo threats, though none came with the intensity that had characterized earlier battles in these waters. As the minutes passed, the shape of the action grew clearer. The torpedo attack had not merely damaged the Japanese column. It had effectively broken its back. Hajikes, Arisher, and Kawakaze were as good as lost, taken out of the fight in rapid succession. Shiger alone would manage to withdraw, carrying the stunned realization that this night, so similar at its start to previous runs down the slot, had turned out very different. For Moosbrugger and his crews, the significance of what had just happened went beyond the immediate tactical result. They had come into the night burdened by the memory of earlier defeats like Savo Island and Tassafaranga, where darkness and long lance torpedoes had favored the Japanese. Now, through careful use of radar and disciplined torpedo tactics, they had reversed that pattern. The Japanese column had been struck first and decisively. The enemy had sailed into an ambush shaped not by searchlights or guesswork, but by invisible beams and plotted lines. The battle was not yet entirely over. Survivors still clung to wreckage. Fire still burned. A damaged destroyer still fled into the dark. But in the essential sense, the outcome had already been decided in those moments when the torpedoes, guided only by calculations and radar-derived tracks, crossed the path of the unsuspecting Japanese ships. The night that had so often punished the Allied fleet in these waters had become the setting for a different story, one in which the tools and training of a new kind of warfare had finally proven themselves in the most unforgiving test of all.